Our second reading is from Gospel of John 16. Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn. The world will rejoice. You will have pain, but your pain will turn into joy. When a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when her child is born, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy of having brought a human being into the world. So you have pain now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. The word of the Lord. I'm delighted to be this morning here with you to preach. I think when I go back, I will have remembered this time as a time of discovery of what I have come to think for myself as a Christian gem of Georgetown. So thank you for letting me experience this. For some time now, I have been working on the question of joy as a theologian, and obviously it has impact not just for our theological reflection, but for our just ordinary lives, and indeed that's exactly the reason why I have taken up this topic of joy. One of the great theologians of past centuries, he's still alive today, but his greatness came to be in the last half of the last century. Jürgen Moltmann, my teacher, has said once that Christianity is uniquely a religion of joy. Now, he wasn't making an empirical statement, right? I'm not sure that this would be true if you just observe Christians, how we are all around the world, that you would come to a conclusion that we are uniquely joyous people. That's why the title of this sermon is Return of Joy. I think he was referring to the character of the Christian faith. Christian faith is not simply about doing something. Christian faith is not simply about believing something. Christian faith is, well, let me say that, about feeling something, and feeling something that is called joy. Christian faith is about rejoicing. Now, if you look at the Gospels, take, for instance, the Gospel of Luke, you will see that the entire Gospel is actually framed by the theme of joy. Shepherds sing when the newborn Christ has come, and they sing of angels sing when shepherds appear. Angels sing of the great joy that will be there for all people. All the way at the end of the Gospel of Luke, now Jesus Christ has suffered, has been crucified, and has ascended to heaven. And then we have a report at the very end of the Gospel of Luke, and they returned to Jerusalem with great joy. You can see that the joy, great joy, bookends the entire Gospel of Luke. And indeed, you can say the Gospel itself, the meaning of the Gospel, is good news. When do we rejoice? Well, we rejoice when something good happens to us. We rejoice when something good happens to us that we haven't quite expected, or something good happened to us that is a gift to us. I think of it sometimes this way. So if you have a good job and you get your regular salary, at first when you get the job you rejoice, but after a while it becomes kind of a normalcy, right? But if at the end of the year you get a bonus, well, that's the reason for rejoicing, right? This is kind of something above and beyond of what is ordinarily expected. So the goods that come to us in a sense as a gift, that is what gives us fundamentally joy. Joy, in some way, comes to us from the good gifts that we receive. Now, if you observe our societies today, I think it's difficult not to conclude that we live in joyless society and that we have become joyless people. You think maybe that's too dour, and you'll tell me, of course we have a lot of fun. And I'll tell you, well, make sure that you distinguish between fun and joy. What's the difference between fun and joy? Sometimes I describe the difference as the difference between bubbly water, something like seltzer, and champagne. Now, bubbles are there in both cases, and they might be, in fact, the most prominent thing that you immediately sense, right? But what's missing in the bubbly water, right, is this wonderful color. What's missing is a different taste, maybe, of some pear or something of that sort in that champagne. And, of course, this little bit of intoxicating feeling. They're bubbly substances, but they're profoundly different. Fun is you can have without any reference to anything good that you experience. You can take something like a fun pill, right? Well, some people smoke weed, and that ends up being something like fun pill, but you can't take joy pill. Because you rejoice over something. You rejoice over something good that has happened to you. It's a feeling, good feeling over good that has happened to you. Now, I said we live in a fun society, but in a joyless society. What are some of the joy inhibitors that we experience in our own lives? And I think two come to mind, and I'm sure you might come up with some more. We live in competitive societies, in societies of unfulfilled and in some ways also unfulfillable desires. Why do I say that? Because we live in societies that thrive on, that are energized by systematically generated discontent. I have to be dissatisfied with iPhone 4 in order to buy iPhone 6. Now, I think this is 5. I've lost track of all the numbers, right? I have not to quite like something that I have so that I can purchase something that somebody wants to sell me, and often iPhone 5 is arguably better than iPhone 4. There's no doubt about a kind of progress that occurs through this. But if I know that there's something better there and I have something worse, it's not so easy, in fact, to rejoice, just as it is not easy to rejoice in the hut that you have when somebody has built a huge mansion next to it, right? Suddenly what you thought was very nice dwelling shrinks into this little thing compared to what's something next to it, the beautiful thing next to it. We live in societies of permanent innovation and competitive societies on top of that, and it's very difficult to rejoice. We had at the Divinity School, one of our conferences was on this question of joy, especially in the context of economy. We had a Czech economist come who was advisor of then President Václav Havel. He wrote a piece for us on joy and economy, and he said in this piece, he said, you can build your economy on discontent. But please don't complain that you're not content. Right? And there's kind of a sense that we never quite reach and therefore never quite rest in what we have achieved and rejoice in it. What comes next to it is also not just these systematically unfulfillable desires or newly generated desires, but also infinite responsibility. We are aware of things happening in other parts of the world around us, everywhere. We feel responsible to do something about it, and what needs to be done is always greater than what we can do, even when we are at our best. Somehow our responsibility is such that we can never actually fulfill it. And we feel guilt over this, kind of subtle guilt, or maybe sometimes simple indifference. Competitiveness, it kind of breeds envy. We push other people down, we puff ourselves up. Infinite responsibility breeds indifference or sometimes guilt. How can you then rejoice? In a sense, nothing is good enough. The world is not good enough. What we have is not good enough. What we do is not good enough. Who we are is not good enough. There is no joy possible in a not good enough world. Because joy comes out of sense that something good, something surprising and good has come to us. In our first text that we have read, Jesus says to his disciples, this is his last speech in a sense to them, remain in my love. Remain in love for one another. And then my joy will be in you, and your joy will be complete. Notice that he doesn't speak about doing acts of love. He talks about being in love. Almost in a sphere that is described by love. We know what it means to be in love, right? Sometimes we experience it as this intense feeling of being in love. There's then wonder, right? There's something unowed that has come to us when we fall in love. And then suddenly we perceive good that we previously haven't perceived. We say love is blind. And maybe love is blind. But maybe also, love helps us see to things that we otherwise would be indifferent to. It helps us see the good which otherwise passes by us. When we love one another, when we love God, we see, we appreciate, we rejoice over something great, good that has come our way. That is the main source of our joy. Now, the second scripture reading that we have read talks not only about joy, but it talks about grief. Obviously, we experience in the world in which we live a great deal of grief. A child gets ill. You work long hours and are unable to meet your needs. Betrayal happens. Varieties of difficulties that we face in our life. Things bear us down. Things break down. And we need to do this hard work of repairing what has been broken. This is what Jesus is talking about. The world, in a sense, is broken. That's why Jesus has come. That's why he is now walking the way of the cross, and he will die for the sins of the world. There is grief that his disciples will have. He himself will experience grief. Is it possible to have a joy in the world that is full of grief, full of suffering? How do we rejoice in just such a world? So what Jesus says to his disciples is that they can rejoice, in a sense, in hope. One can grieve, but grieve in hope of joy that is to come. Typical example that he gives is obviously a woman who's giving a birth to a child. Time of great suffering, time of great pain, time of grief. And yet, once that passes, in a sense, she knows and we know at the end of this comes this extraordinary joy of holding this beautiful creature in your arms. So you can rejoice, in a sense, in hope. You do the love's labor for the sake of love's fruit. And love's fruit is just that joy. In the Epistle of Hebrews, the author of Epistle of Hebrews describes the journey of Jesus. And then he says at one point that for the sake of joy set before him, he endured shame. Meaning he endured the shame of the cross. Even for Jesus himself, kind of the journey into the far country, the journey into the land of suffering was motivated by the promise of joy. In the midst of grief, we can rejoice, anticipate joy that is going to be ours in the future, in hope. But I think we can do a little bit more than just hope for joy in the midst of grief. I think we can also rejoice in grief itself. Now, that's also the difference between fun and joy. It's hard to have fun and mourn at the same time. Those seem to be incompatible. Whereas, I think you can, in some significant sense, rejoice and yet at the same time experience in certain domains of your life grief and even suffering. What is it that we can rejoice over, even in the midst of grief that we often experience? Apostle Paul says at one point, rejoice in the Lord. It's possible to rejoice in the Lord. Doesn't mean to rejoice over everything that's happening to you, but you're rejoicing in the fact that there is the one who holds the entire world in his hands. You rejoice in the good things that come to you from that one. You rejoice and are able to perceive in the world, even in the midst of suffering, that there are good things in life. You know, I'm always struck how aggressive, in some sense, evil is. In the sense that it just grabs your attention. We are almost programmed to see what's wrong, to attend to what's wrong. And obviously that is the preservation instinct that we have. But what we sometimes forget is that what's wrong and that's what's evil rests on the preponderance of the good in our lives. We see what's wrong, but we do not affirm what is good. We are like the newscasters of today, right? I mentioned in the earlier talk, right? We zero in on what's not. When the trains break down, okay, that's newsworthy. When trains run on time for a whole month, that's not newsworthy. That's ordinary, what ordinary life should be, right? Now, that's a compliment to the character of our world, right? If we expect it to be good. But I think we can discover the goodness and perceive that goodness and then rejoice in the goodness of that which is, even though we go through difficulties in our own lives. A kind of sense not to be colonized by the evil we experience, the bad things we experience, but rather to have a wide, expansive view to the good that this world, as a gift from God, is. And then we can rejoice and grieve at the same time. It's almost like when you go to a funeral, right? Funeral of somebody who has lived a wonderful life and blessed people, and it was time for them to go. There's a kind of rejoicing over incredibly beautiful life that has been led, and there is sorrow over ending of that beautiful life, all in the same moment. And I think the practice of rejoicing even at the funeral, even at the little funerals of our lives that we always experience, daily almost experience, this is the kind of the art of living a joyful life. Now, when I was, about a year ago, in Israel, I went to see a good friend of mine who's a rabbi, and he invited me to celebrate with him a Shabbat meal. And so we stayed together and read, and after celebration, we read a passage from a rabbi. And this friend of mine, he knew that I was interested in the question of joy, so he thought, I'll find something to read from a current Jewish thought about joy. And it ended up being one of the most fascinating things that I have experienced, with fascinating insight. I want to share it with you. And it was about celebration of Sabbath. What does it mean to celebrate Sabbath? And he said, well, generally what we think about celebration of Sabbath, we think we stop working. We don't work. And some people, of course, see that as a terrible burden for them because they need to do something and can't work, right? You can see it also as a liberation, right, from the things that come, a set boundary in which you're free not to work. The other important thing is not just that you don't work, other people don't work for you. You don't demand other people to work for you, right? That is to say, Sabbath is not some freeing you from work, but freeing also other people from work as well, so that you have a community as a whole giving rest. Now, this is generally how I thought of the significance of the Shabbat command. But this rabbi, he said, no, it's not simply about not working. Sabbath is not the end of working. It is the end of striving. Why do we strive? We strive to improve things, right? To maintain and improve, keep them in order as good, and to improve them. But when the striving ends, what happens then? When striving ends, that means, well, what is, I basically say, is good. This is exactly what God did after creating world in 6 days. 6 days, it was good. And then there was a Sabbath, right? And Sabbath was good as well. The world, in a sense, was pronounced on Sabbath day to be the good world. Every seventh day is the day to step back from striving, to recognize the goodness that simply is there, that has been created and is there, and therefore to rejoice. Now, you can celebrate that kind of a Sabbath every 7th minute, maybe every 7th hour, but start with every 7th day. It trains us to perceive the goodness that surrounds us, lifts our hearts out of captivity to our own striving, and opens our mouth to rejoice in the good things that we have received. We live in a joyless world. Let us perceive the good of the world that God has created, the good of the giver who has given the good things to us, and let us rejoice. Amen.